think when we see this statement? So almost all Australians meet their nutritional needs for protein. So this was published by the Bureau of Statistics at the end of 2050. So it's very recent. But when I read this, I thought, yeah, I don't know about that. First of all, the question that popped into my mind was, well, what is this based on? What's this number based on, first of all? And then secondly, how relevant is that to us here in Australia? And so what I want to do tonight is speak a little bit about that, the relevance of numbers that are put out for us to maybe be guided by, and then maybe what sort of definitions could potentially be a little bit better for us. But before I delve into that, and I know many of you have come to some of my talks before, or maybe you've watched stuff on YouTube or wherever it might be, but I wanted to give you a little bit of my background so that you understand a bit of where I'm coming from. So that's me there in the middle. When it comes to nutrition, I don't see eye to eye with most other dietitians out in practicing here in Australia. And the reason for that is because when I left university after studying for way too many years, all I was doing was banging my head against the brick wall, and I was utterly frustrated. I worked in clinical practice in numerous large hospitals throughout Australia, throughout Melbourne, and really it was just frustration. And it got to a point, after some very specific experiences with some patients, where I wasn't able to recommend what I knew was right. And I was governed by the hospital and by Dietitians Association of Australia to recommend and make recommendations based around dietary guidelines, which I knew were not appropriate in these situations. And so I left the practice of stopped practicing as a dietitian for a number of years. I worked in the fitness industry, lectured in the fitness industry, and then when I did return, I returned in private practice where I could practice on my own terms. And I always knew that there was something else. There had to be another answer in terms of nutrition. And growing up, I was always in a really, really fit, healthy family. We were always active. We always had whole, real food available, and we were always all healthy and lean. And then I came to uni, and other things were recommended. And so I was always having this bit of a dilemma. Here I was from this healthy family, but all the stuff that I was being shown in research and science at university was different to what we did growing up. And so when I did leave the profession, I got stuck into my own sort of research, and eventually came out with this, I guess, that what we needed to do in order to be healthy was take that pyramid and turn it upside down. And that is where all my nutritional recommendations now come from. And sometimes to more extremes than other, depending on who you are. So some of you might have been here at the low carb talk a couple of weeks ago, and I spoke about the spectrum and different tolerance levels, and we're all pretty different, and we all can't be shoved into the same pyramid and make it work. But we certainly are going to be better off following the upside down one, working from there, rather than the other way around. So that's where I'm coming from today. My protein recommendations for a long time were pretty much in line with what everyone else was recommending, but then I was very lucky enough to be exposed to one man in particular, a guy by the name of Dr. Lehman, who has spent his life dedicated to protein research, and I found out a whole lot of stuff that made a whole lot more sense than just the general recommendations that are out there. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. I want to just clear up something. I think that protein is the most controversial macronutrient. And why do I say that? Because we all have our personal bias when it comes to protein, and that might be based on religion or environmental issues or animal cruelty or politics or whatever that might be, and that is fine, and I have my own views in that respect too, but what I'm here to speak about tonight is purely based on nutritional science. So at the end of tonight, you can take the nutrition science and you can put your personal bias into it, and then you can come out with your own product, because we all need to do that part by ourselves. Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of everything by starting off here. And this is the classification of protein intake. And so I want you to understand where this all comes from and where it arrived from, so that we can make some judgment based on this. So if we look at this, I know graphs are often scary for people and you don't understand them, but I'll explain this step by step so that it makes a lot of sense. So down closer to this end sits what we commonly refer to, and many of you might be familiar with this term, RDI. And RDI is the recommended daily intake. Now, the recommended daily intake is set currently by the World Health Organization at 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight per day. So this, what does that mean, or all of that? We'll get into that in a second. But, why this is important is because in third world countries, those people need to, at a bare minimum, meet 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day in order to meet basic functions, to prevent deficiencies, to prevent malnourishment. This is very relevant in third world countries, and this is what the World Health Organization is concerned with. Is this appropriate, or is this applicable to Australians, where probably all or most of our issues come from an excess of nutrition and not a deficiency? And so this is where you start questioning that statement that I brought up right at the start. Are we meeting our nutritional requirements in terms of protein? Well, we say yes, but that's because it's based on that. Okay, so we're saying, yeah, most Australians meet the RDI. What relevance does that have to us, though? So the next line that goes across there, that red line, is what we refer to as the safe intake range. So this is your safe zone. So we can basically push our intake all the way up to the other end over there. That's upper limit of 2.5 grams per kilogram body weight per day, and some studies even go closer to 3 grams, and we can still be safe. So often what you hear is medical professional, other dietitians kicking and screaming as soon as you mention a higher carbohydrate diet, because if we went outside of the upper limit and we see all of a sudden that grey line goes up, risk of adverse effects. What sort of adverse effects? Things like bone demineralization, we see kidney issues arising, we even see an increase in various cancer rates. That's what happens when we start going above the upper limit. But really, there's not many people who would manage to get there, firstly. And secondly, the type of recommendations that I make in terms of higher are not going there at all. They're just shifting from over here, which is that first star. That's the average Australian currently. So females sit at about 70 grams a day, the average female, and the average male sits at about 90 grams a day. If we just shift slightly along the line towards my star over there, we can see some massive improvements in our diet. And I'm going to go through our outcomes, our health, and I'll go through what those are in a second. But what I want to point out is that this is higher. It's still absolutely within the safe range. It's nowhere near the upper limit. There are no dangerous consequences whatsoever with the sort of higher recommendations of protein that I'm going to speak about this evening. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So you can see that for a 70 kilogram individual, just to put this into numbers of grams per day, the range is massive. 56 grams to 175 grams. In terms of food, you're looking at like quantity-wise, thousands of calories difference. It's a massive range, and so each individual, we need to work out where you're going to sit within this range to be optimised. Okay, so if I'm recommending a slightly higher protein intake, why is that? What are the benefits of having a slightly higher protein intake? So I'm going to run through them just quickly. Basically, we've got things like this. So when we have more protein, we see increased weight loss. We see protection of skeletal muscle, that's our lean body mass. We also see a reduction in body fat because protein doesn't cause as much of an insulin response as carbohydrate does. And therefore, we have more of a chance of burning fat, so we reduce fat. We have this thing called increased thermogenesis. Is anybody familiar with that term? No? So basically, that's the thermic effect of food. So when you eat anything, carbohydrate, fat, protein, we expend a certain amount of energy just to digest, absorb, oxidize that food. So we actually need energy to do that. Now, when we do that to protein, we use a lot more energy than when we do that to carbohydrate and fat. So there's increased thermic effect. We also have increased satiety. That means that we don't feel as hungry. And this relates specifically to the hormones that we will stimulate when we eat protein as opposed to the ones that we stimulate when we eat carbohydrate. So we actually have decrease in a hormone called ghrelin, which helps bring down our hunger levels, makes us feel more satisfied, stops the thought of food. And then we see a rise in another hormone called PYY, peptide YY, and that suppresses hunger. So we see a nicer balance of hormones occurring. We also see enhanced glycemic regulation, and that goes back to the whole carbohydrate and insulin thing. But what I point out at the bottom here is when you look at studies, and this is almost just to protect myself, is that we see these things always in the context of a lower carbohydrate diet as well. So we don't just eat protein, we don't just eat carbohydrate, we eat food which are made up of all of these nutrients. When we have protein, higher protein levels in the context of lower carbohydrate, this is when these sorts of things are going to be escalated.